Welcome to the video overview of Module 6, the syllogism. The syllogism is the most basic and therefore the most important unit of reasoning. It contains all possible arguments in compact, digestible form. A syllogism is the most basic argument because it contains at least two premises and one conclusion. For example, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. The structure of the syllogism. These are the essential ingredients of a syllogism. There are three propositions, two premises, and one conclusion. There are three terms. Each term is used twice. The subject of the conclusion is called the minor term. The predicate of the conclusion is called the major term. The term which appears in each premise but not in the conclusion is called the middle term. The premise containing the major term is called the major premise. The premise containing the minor term is called the minor premise. So as you see in the example, if all A are B and all B are C, then all A are C. This is a logical deduction. C is the major term, A is the minor term, and the middle term is B. Analyzing a syllogism. First, identify the conclusion. Then identify the minor and major terms. They are respectively the subject and predicate of the conclusion. Then identify the major and minor premises. They contain respectively the major and minor terms. Finally, identify the middle term as the term that is left, the term that is not in the conclusion, but is in each premise. How do syllogisms work? Well, in case number one, if both S and P are related affirmatively to M, the middle term, in the premises, then S and P must be related affirmatively to each other in the conclusion. In case number two, a negative conclusion, if S and P are related to M, the middle term, in opposite ways in the premises, if one of them is related to M affirmatively and the other negatively, then S and P must be related to each other negatively in the conclusion. So you have two different situations here. 2A, if S and M agree, the subject term or the minor term and the middle term agree, but the middle term and the major term do not, then the subject and predicate of the conclusion do not. For example, no mortals are gods, and all men are mortals, therefore no men are gods. Alternately, in case 2b, if the subject of the conclusion or the minor term and the middle term do not agree, but the middle term and the major term do, then the minor and major terms do not. The subject and predicate of the conclusion do not. For example, computers are machines, and humans are not machines, therefore humans are not computers. Case number three, what if the subject and predicate of the conclusion are both related to the middle term negatively? Then we know nothing about how they are related to each other. We cannot prove a negative conclusion from negative premises. For example, no men are insects, and no insects write logic books, therefore no men write logic books. This is an invalid conclusion. Syllogisms are, of course, only as good as the premises on which it is based. This means that a good syllogism must not only be valid, but have true premises. But don't we need syllogisms to prove the truth of the premises and so on ad infinitum? Not necessarily. As Aristotle argued long ago, the regress stops because all proof depends on self-evident premises. These self-evident premises are either evident to the senses, for example, fire is hot, or to the mind, 2 plus 2 equals 4. We do not prove these are true because we directly experience them as true. If the conclusion of a syllogism contradicts a self-evident premise, then we have a contradiction. At the basis of all logical thought is the law of non-contradiction. Nothing can both be and not be in the same way and at the same time. Nothing can both be X and non-X at the same time and in the same respect. Of course, those are crucial qualifications. A chair can be both black and white, but not at the same time. Someone, it could be white at, say, 1 year, and then someone could paint it black the next year, nor in the same respect. A chair can be both black and white, but it could be black with respect to the seat, but white with regard to the frame, or with respect to the frame and so forth. But something cannot both be black and white at the same time and in the same respect, for example. The law of excluded middle. Either X or non-X, or everything must either be or not be. There's no middle ground between whether something is the case or not the case. Either human beings landed on the moon or they did not, for example. Principle of sufficient reason. Everything that has a sufficient reason why, everything that is has a sufficient reason why it is, both why it exists and why it is what it is. For example, if something just inexplicably popped into existence out of nothing, then what is necessarily true could inexplicably become necessarily false and vice versa. All rational thought would crumble. And to add to this, if something just simply popped into existence out of nothing, that would not prove that there is no such thing as causality or any sort of cause to that, but we would simply say that the cause is simply not evident to us, that there's maybe another dimension or what have you. Demonstrative syllogisms. These are syllogisms that are not only valid, but also give the reason for the truth of the conclusion and the argument itself, usually the middle term. See the contrast between the following two syllogisms. These, of course, are from Krefft. Whatever is composed of parts is destructible. Whatever is material is composed of parts. Therefore, whatever is material is destructible. Or whatever is material is able to reflect light waves. Consciousness is not able to reflect light waves. Therefore, consciousness is not material. In number 1, the first example, the middle term is the real reason or cause for the conclusion being true, while in 2, it is not. In other words, in 1, we are given the essential reason why matter is destructible. So, composed of parts. This is the middle term, whatever is composed of parts. This gives the real reason why matter is destructible. Right? But in 2, we're only given an accident, or at best a property of matter. Right? Matter, whatever is material, is able to reflect, or being able to reflect light waves is, of course, a property or attribute, usually of matter, but does not give us the reason why, for example, consciousness is not material. It's an indication that it's not material, but it doesn't give us the reason. Constructing convincing syllogisms. First, know what conclusion you want to prove or argue for. 2, put your conclusion into logical form. This will give you your two terms, the subject and predicate, S and P. The key step is to find a good middle term, one that naturally joins the other two terms. This is best done by instinct and intuition, by imitation, practice, and habituation. Since the middle term is really the reason for the conclusion, all you have to do is ask yourself, what is the reason for your conclusion? And you will have your middle term. Ask yourself, what is the real reason for your conclusion? And you will make a demonstrative syllogism. Finally, check your syllogism for validity. But how do we check our syllogisms for validity? The easiest and most intuitive way is to do it through Euler circles. This is in first part of chapter 11. We diagram the first premise first, then we diagram the second premise and conclusion. If the diagram for the conclusion agrees with the combined diagram of the premises, the syllogism is valid. If it's not clear or unambiguous, however, where the subject or predicate of the conclusion need to go, then the argument is invalid. The problem with Euler circles, however, is that they are not as clear in demonstrating the validity or invalidity of syllogisms with particular propositions, that is, I or O propositions. Almost as easy and far more accurate and precise are the 6 rules of Aristotle, which I will now go through. Rule number 1. Syllogism must have 3 and only 3 terms. The violation of this rule is called the fallacy of 4 terms. For example, whatever is in sense experience is material, and all knowledge comes from sense experience, therefore all knowledge is material. Here we have a fallacy of 4 terms. Why? Well, the conclusion, knowledge, is the subject, whatever is material is the predicate. The middle term, however, whatever is in sense experience and whatever comes from sense experience. This, of course, can be deceptive. In other words, this fallacy is sometimes hard to spot. But whatever is in sense experience is not the same thing as whatever comes from sense experience. So here, the person making the argument is very subtly shifting the meaning of the middle term so that we have really 4 terms. Or all power tends to corrupt, knowledge is power, therefore knowledge tends to corrupt. Here, power is used in 2 different senses. So we have the fallacy of equivocation. Actually. Rule number 2. A syllogism must have 3 and only 3 propositions. There is no named fallacy for the violation of this rule. We must be careful here. Sometimes it looks as if an argument has only 2 propositions, but in this case, the 3rd proposition is implied. In this case, we have what is called an enthemy, that is, that which is held in mind, or an abbreviated syllogism, and as long as we can supply the missing premise, it is valid, at least in form. For example, man is mortal because he's material is an enthemy, and so we could simply supply the missing premise. Right? All that is mortal is that which is material, and therefore we have a valid syllogism. Rule number 3. The middle term must be distributed at least once. The violation of this rule is called the fallacy of the undistributed middle. For example, the syllogism in which the middle term functions correctly, babies are not sages, and saints are sages, therefore babies are not saints. Or example of a syllogism which violates this rule, all dogs are animals, all cats are animals, therefore all dogs are cats. This is obviously fallacious. Or another example of a more subtle violation of this rule, all terrorists are those who want to bring down the globalist economic system. Candidate X wishes to bring down the globalist economic system, therefore candidate X is a terrorist. This, of course, is a fallacious argument because it is using a middle term that is not distributed at least once. And almost all arguments in that form, so all terrorists are Muslims, all immigrants are Muslims, therefore all immigrants are terrorists, is of course obviously a fallacious argument. Rule number 4. No term that is undistributed in the premise may be distributed in the conclusion. There are 2 fallacies associated with this rule. Fallacy of illicit minor. Here the term that is illicitly distributed is the minor term. And fallacy of illicit major. Here the term that is illicitly distributed is the major term. For example, compassion is a virtue. Justice is not compassion. Therefore, justice is not a virtue. Or, no violence is just. All violence is aggression. Therefore, no aggression is just. These are fallacious arguments in which either the minor or the major term is illicitly distributed. Rule number 5. No syllogism can have 2 negative premises. The fallacy here is the fallacy of 2 negative premises, quite evidently. For example, birds are not fish, humans are not fish, therefore humans are not birds. Well, the conclusion is true, but the argument is completely worthless. Or odd numbers are not even numbers, 3 is not an even number, therefore 3 is not an odd number. This is also obviously, here the conclusion is obviously false, and therefore it is fallacious. Or, I shouldn't say therefore, but it is also fallacious. Rule number 6. If one premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative. And if the conclusion is negative, one premise must be negative. There's no name for this fallacy. For example, no dogs are angels, and no mammals are angels, therefore all dogs are mammals. This is, of course, fallacious. Well, of course, it has 2 negative premises, but also it has an affirmative conclusion where it has to be negative. Or, no philosophers are angels and no lawyers are angels, therefore all philosophers are lawyers, is also fallacious. So if one of the premises is negative, then the conclusion has to be negative. Krefft also gives us 2 corollaries to these 6 rules. Why are these corollaries? Because actually these don't introduce any new rule. These particular corollaries are already covered by the 6 rules, but they give us a shortcut. They allow us to see that a argument